working right off the bat. Alright, so I thought we'd start today with a little bit of a preview of the next patch, 9.20.1. There are some pretty important changes, but that we might take this time to go over them because that we're currently on the second iteration, just came out a few days ago. And so that generally means that it's going to be going out rolling out live pretty soon, maybe as early as this week. I guess we will find out. Generally speaking, when I look at the common test and I look at the changes that they make, if they don't make a lot of changes like in the second iteration, or if they're all just sort of minor tweaks, you can kind of get the sense that it's getting ready to go live, and I kind of get that sense from this particular tank, or from this particular patch. So anyhow, what we'll do is we'll go over some of the changes that I think are important. I won't go over every single change, but just some of them that I think will be interesting. And so one of the big changes for this particular patch are the changes to personal missions, which they now will have up here in this on the tab up top here where it says campaign. So all you got to do is click on that and it'll take you to your personal missions, and then you can go to whichever one you are on. And all they did really is change the presentation for a lot of these, and so it's in this nice graphical format for those of you who've played World of Warships. So they have a very similar sort of layout for that. And I like this. I think that this is a good representation for the things that you're going to do. And so for the ones that you haven't completed yet, they'll be sort of grayed out, and you can sort of select them and you can look at the at them. So there's more than just presentation changes for a lot of these. So almost in general, all of the more difficult missions, more RNG based missions, were made slightly easier in this patch. So if you have those missions that you haven't quite been able to get through yet, then now might be the time to do it. There is one notable exception to this, in that they made TD15, which is this guy, for the Object 260 specifically, this particular mission, a little bit more difficult, because before it was, cause 8,000 damage and destroy 5 vehicles, and now it's cause 8,000 damage and destroy 6. But that's not that much of a difference, but that is not as easy as one might think. So the other sort of categorical change that they made to these personal missions was the introduction of these orders. And so basically, if you completed any of these missions, the final missions are for any of these. So like let's take this one for example. So the medium missions for the Stug. If you complete the secondary condition for this particular mission, then you will be awarded an order. And you can use these orders to skip over any of the missions. And so for example, this is probably what I will end up doing for Tank Destroyer 15, right? Once I get to this mission, I will just go ahead and use an order to skip it, right? Right now I have to use 4 in order to get it. I don't know exactly how they got that math. But so that's another reason to go back and make sure that you have those secondaries done for all of these guys, which is actually going to be slightly helpful, because now, for example, although sort of in comparison, now again you do have to. I guess the other thing I forgot to mention is that you do have to get. They basically you had to finish basically 4 out of every 5, so you had to do you had to skip maybe light tanks or SPGs if you weren't really one of those guys. And now whereas what you have to do is you have to complete the 15th mission in all of these in order to get a piece of the tank, in this case the 260. So you are going to have to complete all of them, but I think those orders will end up making it easier for those ones that either you don't have the appropriate tanks for, or there's just unrealistic conditions for what you want. So those are the changes to the personal missions, and I think overall, as I was saying earlier, it makes everything easier, which is of course good for everybody. All right, and then there are also a number of changes to the tanks, primarily, or not primarily, I guess one of the biggest points of interest is the introduction of the Super Conqueror, and that's replacing the 215B, which is now becoming a premium tank, much like they did with the Foch 155 in the last patch. And so this is the 215B gun on the right, and this is the Super Conqueror gun on the left. When in the first iteration on common test, the Super Conqueror gun was worse than the 215B gun. In the second iteration, they buffed it so that it's basically on par with the 215B gun. Thanks for the resubs, Butter Bacon Eggs. And yes, I had an excellent weekend. Thank you. And so basically the only difference between these two are a bit of aim time. The other thing is that, so when the Super Conqueror first came out in the first iteration, when I looked at it, I was a bit worried because the dispersion was pretty bad and the gun control DPM was pretty bad relative to the 215B. So it looked like they were giving it a different platform, but also giving it a worse gun, and that's not really what you want to see. But in the second iteration, they not only brought up the rate of fire, they also reduced the amount of dispersion as well. So I haven't messed around with the tank itself yet, but I'm hoping that it's going to be more on par with the 215B. It doesn't have to be quite there because it does have, that's not the right tank. It does have a reasonably solid turret. Again, I have to look at the armor model to get a sense for how difficult it's going to be to pen that cupola, but I don't think that it'll be a super issue, especially considering that these tanks have 10 degrees of depression, which is another important thing that they did for all of those tier 8 heavy, all of the British heavies from tier 8 to tier 10 now have 10 degrees of depression, which is a good amount of depression and gives you an opportunity to hold down, particularly if you have a decent turret. They also did buff the Carniverne gun and the Conqueror gun as well. And for the Carniverne, they added a 32-pounder, which is it's an interesting choice that they made because they're not just basically what you had on the old one was it was like the 22-pounder or whatever it was, but it was lower alpha. So what they present to you now with the Cairn is just not really a choice at all. You know, on some tanks there's a choice between, oh, should I use this gun or this gun? Pretty much as soon as you can use the 32-pounder, you should use it because it is a far superior gun to the stock gun here. And this is actually the same gun that they allow you to have on the Conqueror as well, the 32-pounder, which is not necessarily a bad option except for the fact that this 120 that you can put on it it's a really, really nice gun. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how these British heavies play out now because they have been brought up a little bit, and this is something that people have complained about with these tanks. And so now the way that I see it, like, you know, the 8, 9, 10s, well, the 8 and 9, the 10 gun was always good. In tier 8 and tier 9, I think it'll be easier to play for people because you'll have more of a definable niche in that, you know, you can hold down in certain situations. You have better gun depression, so you can get easier shots, particularly off of terrain, and you also have better guns to be able to use. So Datalink is saying that the cupola for the Super Conqueror is going to be difficult to pen, which I could see them doing. Like, I don't think that they want to make it like a E5 vulnerability, but I think, like, when you look at the expected, you know, expected presentation of the tank, like particularly if they're at elevation, right, you're always going to be firing up at it. So I think that's sort of what, you know, as opposed to like the E5, where the E5 is much more of a donut on top of the tank. I couldn't think of it looks like a big eye on, oh, here it is. Right, it's like more straightforward, whereas the Super Conqueror one is more flat. And so basically what that means is that the higher of an elevation the tank is on, the more of a silly angle that this type of anatomy is going to be. But yeah, so I think it'll be interesting to play these tanks now, or interesting to see how they play out, assuming that they hit live in this particular configuration. We'll also talk a little bit about the tank destroyers, because they did buff these tank destroyers. Basically, the 7, 8, 9, 10, they changed a number of things on them, but mostly it was gun depression, gun control type of issues. They did, in the first iteration, buff the speed on a number of them, and then in the second iteration, they decided to take that away for the most part. Of note, the Conway has 2 guns now, this 120 and this 5.5 inch gun. I hate when they mix the terminology. But anyway, so it's basically, it's not really a derp gun, it is a higher alpha gun. The interesting to note is that it does have a 200 pen Hess shell on it, which is, you know, very reminiscent to a lot of the British high caliber Hess shells. But I don't really find that Hess gives you that much. It gives you better alpha, but of course you're gonna take that higher alpha at the cost of worse gun control. And if you decide to fire AP shells out of this 5.5 inch gun, then you're gonna nerf your own DPM, which hurts you a lot. Whereas you still have good DPM with the 120. So like, this is another one of those situations where I look at these 2 guns and I go, well, why wouldn't I use the 120? Because even if I use the 5.5 and fire only Hesh, I have to pen every time that I shoot that Hesh in order to basically get slightly better DPM, or maybe just on par DPM to the 120 where I can just fire AP. So I don't necessarily think that that's a good deal in this particular case. The other thing that they did buff was on the 4005. I think they made the engine a little bit stronger, and they improved the gun handling characteristics as well as the amount of ammo that I can carry. But I don't think that any of those things, any of these changes are gonna like make the like this a super desirable tank destroyer line. Of note, you know, this is something that we talked about in the stream previously when I talked about the Charioteer. I actually like the Charioteer as one of the tanks that I targeted when I was doing my preview of the British tank destroyer lines, because it basically plays like a medium, and so it still does that. They just gave it better gun depression, which was always a problem for it before, particularly if you had to be up on terrain, and that is changed now, because I think it's at like -10 or something like that. I forget the details exactly, but it's actually pretty significant. So that'll be interesting for the Charioteer as well, which I already felt was a decent tank destroyer. Okay. The other thing that they are changing are the tier 10 light tanks in particular. They're buffing basically a number of the guns on the tier 10 light tanks. This is something that we addressed 2 patches ago, whenever the light tanks came out, where we were talking about why the light tank guns were where the light tanks were underwhelming in general, because they all received a gun nerf across the board initially. So some of these tanks will be receiving increased alpha, some of them will be receiving increased control, things like that. But for the most part, all of them will be getting some buffs, and we'll have to kind of see how that plays out. I think it's difficult for me to say exactly, because it wasn't like they gave them huge buffs, and we'll have to see kind of whether they end up with a role relative to the tier 10 mediums, or whether they're still just, you know, crappy mediums with slightly better guns now. And so those are the major tank changes that occurred in this upcoming patch. And so I kind of get the impression, at least based on if I were to guess, and I don't know that you should take stock in this for anything, I would say that we'll probably get get it to go live next week, unless something on, you know, like the grand battles, or, you know, something else like completely is breaking the game. It seems like they've tuned the tank balance in the way that they wanted it, more or less. So I think we're probably going to be good to go here. So yeah, so that's my mini review of 9.20.1, and yeah, thanks for watching.